How's it going, everybody? Um, just realized I was just realized I already what's it called? Set up the stream. Gonna quickly tweet this out, and then I'll be ready. Yeah. How's it going, everybody? Um, Nobody's in here yet, but that's fine. Let me take my quick little rip, and we can start this video. All right.
This episode and others like it are brought to you by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support this channel, join our patrons-only Discord, and get early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. In the immortal words of philosopher Tom DeLonge, work sucks, I know.
Based.
So what if we worked less? You know that feeling when you get to work on Wednesday morning and you're like, man, I've still got half a week to go. It's awful, and people have been experiencing that same feeling for like 100 years now. Though admittedly, back then, most workers were just glad they weren't working 100-hour weeks like their parents had. All the way back in 1926, the Ford Motor Company decided to implement a 5-day, 40-hour work week. This was due to a number of factors. Primarily pressure from militant labor, but also the fact that Henry Ford thought that by offering pretty solid employment perks for the time, comparatively good work-life balance, and a wage well above the average, he could grow his customer base, which would increase brand recognition and drive further sales. A little over a decade later, the Fair Labor Standards Act codified a 44-hour workweek in federal law, and that was adjusted to 40 hours per week 2 years later. This meant that if bosses wanted their employees to work longer hours, they'd have to pay overtime. There were, and still are, plenty of exceptions to this rule, but that's a topic for another video. The point is, there haven't been any meaningful changes to the federally recognized work week since the World War II era. Why is that? Let's look at some historical context. The period leading up to the recognition of the 5-day, 40-hour work week was incredibly tumultuous. You had the First World War, intense labor and union activity pushing for better conditions, the Great Depression, and then the Second World War. Americans were fed up with being treated like dirt and used as cannon fodder for the benefit of society's upper crust.
Let me do this.
In addition to these factors, the Industrial Revolution shifted the way we look at work. It drew hundreds of thousands of people into new, developing cities to work in factories, and productivity went through the roof with the implementation of new machinery. The combination of these technological, economic, and social factors made it possible for workers to secure some important victories for labor, including the modern work week as we know it. If you'd like to learn a bit more about the importance and power of militant labor, check out the recent episode we did on unions. Now, if productivity gains were a major factor in winning the 5-day work week, why haven't we seen something similar in more recent years? Since 1979, breakthroughs in computing and other modern technologies have allowed a sort of second industrial revolution. Productivity has once again swiftly increased and has vastly outpaced worker compensation. We're getting more done today in a single afternoon than our grandparents could have done in a week, and we're getting paid less for it when adjusted for inflation and cost of living. We don't need to work as many hours as we do to accomplish our tasks. So why haven't we shortened the work week accordingly? Well, as with most things starting around the 70s and 80s, we can thank everyone's favorite president, Ronald Reagan. It shouldn't surprise anyone that delinking productivity gains from worker compensation was intentional. Policymakers in the Reagan era, and in the extended Reagan universe since then, have tried their best to decouple economic growth from employee compensation, meaning that as companies reap larger profits, they don't also have to raise employee pay, which in turn means more of that money goes into the pockets of executives and shareholders. This more conservative economic worldview, part of Reagan's famous trickle-down economics, which, mind you, has been thoroughly debunked in recent years, also explains the reason we haven't heard much talk of shortening the work week. Why give workers more time off when you can just keep squeezing more value out of them? But here's the thing. We have the data to show that a shorter work week not only improves workers' lives, but positively impacts the company they work for too. Let me explain. It's no secret that humans aren't productive the entire 8 or so hours they're at work. There's just not enough to keep us busy for that long. The exact figures vary by industry, but on average, workers are only engaged in productive, business-related activities for less than 60% of the day. The stats for office workers are particularly striking. Assuming an 8-hour day, the average office worker is only productive for 2 hours and 23 minutes. That's a huge amount of time where there's just nothing to do. There are only so many emails you can respond to after all. Now, we've got a couple options here. The first is for the boss to find a way to force workers to be productive for the entire 8 hours, or at least closer to it. Usually this takes the form of enforcing busy work. For me, when I worked at Best Buy selling cameras, that meant polishing the lens cases anytime I wasn't actively talking to a customer. And let me tell you, those were the cleanest panes of glass in all of Texas. After a certain point, it's just ridiculous to try to keep workers working for the sake of not being unproductive. Obviously, this practice has overwhelmingly negative effects. It's mind-numbing, pointless, and makes you hate your job and your boss just a little bit more. Even from a capitalist perspective, it's pretty clear that enforcing maximum productivity is a net negative. That's where shortening the work week comes in. There have been a number of 4-day workweek trials in different countries over the last few years. Let's take a look at some of the conclusions from the most recent experiments, which were conducted in the US and Ireland in 2022. The two trials, which began in February and March, consisted of 33 companies and over 900 employees. The premise was simple. Companies that were interested in trying out a reduced work week received training, tools, and prep to make sure the transition from 5 days to 4 went smoothly. The goals were to maintain productivity and revenue while increasing employee morale and improving work-life balance. But the actual results blew those goals out of the water. Not only did revenue not decrease, it actually rose by 8%.
Dead.
Employee retention rose. Absenteeism dropped. 2/3 of workers reported lower levels of burnout. Ratings for mental and physical health improved as workers could get more sleep and had more time to exercise. And they were less bored at work since there was less pointless downtime and busy work. Across the board, in every aspect of work, ratings improved for both the employees and the companies. These pilot programs were so successful that 97% of involved workers responded in favor of continuing the 4-day work week. Presumably, those last 3% just really like water cooler small talk about the weather or something. Very few things in life return results as clearly positive as these 4-day workweek trials. This is clearly the way forward, and it's essentially unanimous among workers, with some of them even reporting that no amount of money could convince them to return to a 5-day workweek. And all this is just considering the immediate effects on companies and their workers. The subsequent social and environmental effects would also be significant. Take commuting, for example. If a 4-day workweek were implemented at the federal level, that's a 20% reduction in commuting overnight. Roughly 130 million Americans drive to work every day. Think of the reduction in emissions from car exhaust from this one change alone. That is a staggering improvement, and one with essentially zero drawbacks, except presumably more intense propaganda from the fossil fuel industry as their profits shrink. Then as far as societal changes go, just think about what you would do with an extra weekend day every week. Think how many more meaningful things we could do with family and friends, or heck, just by ourselves. Simply getting to decompress and take an extra day for ourselves would dramatically improve the mental health of the entire workforce. You'd end up with a country of happier, healthier, less stressed, more rested workers. This, by every possible measure, is a no-brainer. So, what's the catch? This sounds a little too good to be true. Well, for one thing, we have to consider where exactly this push is coming from. This guy, Andrew Barnes, is the one more or less responsible for popularizing the notion of the 4-day workweek. He's a CEO himself, a position antagonistic to labor. Even if he has the best of intentions, the inherent contradictions between capital and labor makes his advocacy for a 4-day workweek tenuous at best. Regardless of how nice a guy he seems, look at how he talks about the initiative.
Now, people were changing their behaviors. They were recognizing that the day off was a gift, and it had to be earned. It wasn't something that you could just take for granted.
Barnes sees the 4-day week as a gift to his workers, not as a right based simply on the fact that productivity has increased so dramatically in the last 100 years. That perspective is obviously flawed, and should serve as a useful reminder and a warning that the capitalist class is always willing to rescind these privileges in order to increase their profits. Indeed, if you listen to most of the executives who praise the initiative, it's less about the fact that a 4-day workweek is just common sense and more humane, and more about the fact that it yields more efficient and compliant cogs in their machine. This is not to say that these executives are necessarily bad people, just that the goals of capital and labor are in direct conflict. The goal of capital is to increase profits and decrease costs, and the goal of labor is to get as much money as possible for their time and labor power. These two things will never be in alignment. But in the case of the 4-day workweek, it's about as close as it gets. The trials we've seen so far have followed the 100-80-100 model, a proposition that guarantees 100% of the workers' normal pay in 80% of the time, with a commitment to deliver 100% of their work in that time. Workers get time off and keep their pay. Businesses reduce costs in the form of electricity, turnover, and inefficiency. There are benefits to both parties. And that is the only reason we might see this actually come to pass. But here's the thing. While we absolutely should push for the federal implementation of a 4-day workweek, we also have to be cognizant of the fact that until that time, this initiative is entirely dependent on the willingness of the capitalist class. We only won the 5-day workweek thanks to a tremendously powerful militant labor movement. Same with all the other things we take for granted today. Child labor laws, workplace safety laws, Social Security, vacation time, and so much more. As we've explored in past videos, we are at the beginning of a new labor movement, but it's nowhere near as strong as it was 100 years ago. I'm not saying that to discourage anyone, but rather to remind you that without the strength of militant labor behind the movement for a 4-day workweek, the capitalist class will not feel any pressure to actually go through with it, especially in industries where reducing working hours would cut into profits. So yes, while it is obvious that it's high time to bring our conception of work into the 21st century, we also need to continue building the labor movement so that we can demand these changes, not depend on the unreliable and self-serving generosity of the capitalist class. There was a time when workers had real say in their working conditions, and we can have that again. If you'd like to be a part of that, look into unionizing your workplace or joining a socialist organization. I've left links to the IWW and some of the bigger orgs in the description. Every one of us has a role to play. It's only together that we can force the change we want to see. Why not start with a 4-day workweek? I mentioned at the beginning of this video that my channel is only possible thanks to my patrons on Patreon. As some of you may remember, I used to make general interest science videos. I didn't particularly enjoy it, but it was easy to get sponsors for that kind of content. When I made the switch to political content, something I actually do enjoy, most of my sponsors bailed. It's understandable, not many brands want to associate with anti-capitalist content, but that means I've had to rely more heavily on the generosity of viewers like you. I've got one reliable sponsor left, and it's a little nerve-wracking not to have much predictable income to count on. If you're able to chip in even $1 a month, I would greatly appreciate your support. As a little show of that appreciation, every patron, regardless of donation amount, gets early access to every video, plus access to our patrons-only Discord server. It's a great place to hang out. We've got everything from a recommended reading list, to a book club, to countless other channels to chat, learn, and explore your interests. We've built a great little community, and we'd love for you to be part of it. So if you'd like to help keep this channel afloat and get some great perks while you're at it, consider becoming a patron by visiting patreon.com/secondthought. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my other content by following the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week. This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. If you'd like to help support this channel, plus get access to our patrons-only Discord server and early access to every video, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. A lot of people don't like talking about politics because they think it's too complicated. And if that's you, I don't blame you. The language of politics makes it incredibly difficult to understand what's going on. On the news, political words are very often misused or vaguely applied. Politicians identify with labels that don't describe them, and often reject the labels that do. Similar-looking words mean very different things. And to top it all off, political movements and the words they're associated with change and evolve over time. So a word that means something one day, 50 years later, might mean something else. That's the case for social democracy. If you've never heard the term before, that's probably because here in the States, we never use it. Instead, we tend to mislabel social democracy and call it socialism. Think Bernie Sanders or the Nordic countries in Europe. We know them as socialist, but according to most political textbooks and in just about every other country in the world, they're clearly understood as social democratic. There's a difference between these two things, and I'll get to why that difference matters in a second. But in case you don't watch the whole video, in just one sentence, the difference between socialism and social democracy is the relationship with capitalism that each philosophy advocates. For social democrats, capitalism is something that can be contained, reformed, or compensated for. Depending on the social democrat, capitalism is either a necessary evil or a genuinely positive economic model that simply needs to be reined in from its excesses and guided in a positive direction. In contrast, for socialists, capitalism is something that must be replaced by a fundamentally different economic model, one that is not driven by profit and in which production and distribution are organized democratically, not by wealthy and powerful individuals. The socialist goal is to transcend capitalism, while social democrats believe cleaning it up is enough. It wasn't always like this, but since at least the 1959 Godesberg Program was ratified by the German Social Democratic Party, social democrats have openly rejected the idea of replacing capitalism. In practice, that means that a social democratic country has a capitalist economy, one where the vast majority of productive businesses are owned by just a few people, and profits are businesses' animating drive. This is balanced out by a robust welfare state, safety net, and/or universal public services in health and education. A few utilities and industries especially prone to monopoly may be nationalized, and sometimes even operated by the state. There is wealth redistribution from the wealthy to the poor through taxation, and generally the economy is regulated through indirect means like subsidies or taxes. These are all things that socialists give critical support to as ways to ameliorate capitalism in the short term, but that we don't consider to be nearly enough for the actual end goal.
No, I can't really do that.
This video will explain why. If you're a social democrat, someone who supports Bernie Sanders, AOC, or looks to countries like Sweden and Denmark as models for what the US could be, odds are we see eye to eye on a lot of things. We most likely agree on social justice, our criticisms of laissez-faire capitalism, and on a number of political issues from climate change to abortion to workers' rights. But for the rest of this video, I'm going to explain why I specifically advocate for socialism on this channel and not social democracy. It's not to be dogmatic or sectarian or to throw away pragmatism, nor is it to have a book measuring contest to see which of us is the most left-wing and call that a victory. It's because the historical record, political theory, and our present context all show that when it comes to the goals we share for a more egalitarian, just, and sustainable world, capitalism isn't something that we can rehabilitate. It always fights back. And when it's kept on a leash instead of being replaced, it always wins. In other words, social democracy is too unstable and incomplete for the results we're all looking for.
Washington State residents, if you have a utility meter like this on the side of your house, you could get paid to go solar for no money out of pocket. It costs nothing to install the panels and can immediately get a credit on your bill when your meter runs backwards. And then you get paid for the excess power you produce from solar. There are federal and state subsidies available to you to get paid to go solar, and you'll want to take advantage of them before the end of the year. There is a catch. Not all homes qualify.
Let's skip
First,
that ad.
the most basic objection that we socialists have with social democracy is that it's still capitalism. That may be obvious, but just to remind you, capitalism is an absurd economic system, where a tiny unelected minority of people get the vast majority of people to work for them so that they can get wealthier. Due to the inherent nature of capitalism, a few people own an ever-shrinking number of companies, and everyone else fights over the crumbs that fall off the table. Even in social democracies, the vast majority of people don't elect their boss. They don't have a say in the decisions that affect whether they have a job or not, and their work makes that unelected, unaccountable guy richer. For an ideology with democracy in the name, social democracy notably fails to provide democracy in the place where you spend most of your waking hours. High unionization and tripartite negotiations between the state, capitalists, and labor make that better than under a pure laissez-faire approach, but they still only balance the scales between the one guy at the top of the company and the 99 people who work there. They don't actually account for the number of people on each side the way a democracy would. They only make sure that the one guy doesn't go too far and still gets most of the money.
I need to get on top of that.
And regardless, people in any capitalist society are bound to the profit motive. So the decisions workers make in this marginally better situation, even if they had full democratic agency, still need to produce a profit for their company and their economy. So the typical capitalist race to the bottom still applies, as everyone tries to outcompete for higher profit margins. But that's domestically, where workers' exploitation is relatively low and compensated for by a good safety net and universal amenities. Salaries in social democracies are high and public services are great. The problem with social democracy is that in order for capitalists to make good profits under this arrangement, where they pay their workers slightly better and don't get the board as much, somebody somewhere needs to be exploited a lot more. And that's where the global south comes in. For social democracies to provide their citizens their high standard of living and capitalists their profits, the global poor need to be taken advantage of. Let's talk about H&M for a second. H&M is a Swedish brand known for shirts that say stuff like, "My other car is Bing chilling," and shockingly, other horrible decisions. H&M is of course the second largest fashion retailer in the world, with profits in the billions of dollars. And to achieve that status, the company relies on the cheapest labor it can find. Its wealth is built on the extremely polluting fast fashion model, which is the clothing world's version of planned obsolescence. It's been found guilty of greenwashing on multiple occasions, contracts from factories that sure do seem to catch on fire a lot, and of course it doesn't pay its workers a living wage. Something it promised to do back in 2013 when people found out, but come 2018 when H&M said it would have sorted all this out, the company hit us with the classic freshman year economics, what even is a living wage? No, really, the company said there is no universally agreed level for living wages, and then it kept paying its workers like garbage. I'm using H&M as a recognizable example here, but this kind of behavior is by no means unique to this brand. The problem with social democracy is that Swedish workers would never be treated the way H&M treats its workers in the global south. But it's okay with it happening to workers employed by a Swedish company somewhere else in the world. And thanks to the fact that it does, people in Sweden get cheap clothes, and the taxes on the company back home allow the government to provide great public services. Now, this isn't different from any other capitalist country, mind you. It's not a problem unique to social democracy, and that's the point. Social democracy is built on the principles of justice and egalitarianism, but the fact that it benefits from exploitation and imperialism, particularly of this kind, shows the limits that a social democracy runs into when it agrees to follow the rules of global capitalism, which it has to. Like other capitalist countries, in order for the line to consistently go up, wealth needs to be extracted from poorer countries. If you want to learn more about that, I did a whole video on it a while back, and the Marxist Project also has a really great summary of the different ways capitalist imperialism works. But let's shift the focus back to the domestic situation. Another reason that socialists aren't social democrats is because in social democracies, the power of the capitalist class must always be catered to or society suffers the consequences. Under social democracies, progressive politics aren't gains made by the working class, but concessions granted to them by the ruling capitalist class that can be taken away at any moment. That's because, under social democracy, capital retains tremendous power, which it can use in things like capital strikes. A capital strike, like a labor strike, happens when capital refuses to work. Except capitalists don't actually work, so really a capital strike is when capitalists refuse to invest, sitting on their hands and piles of cash, and/or deciding to move their capital to another country in what's called capital flight. Because social democratic societies protect the sanctity of private capital like all capitalist societies do, meaning that they are very apprehensive of expropriating capital even in times of crisis where literally one person can screw over hundreds of others, social democracies are incredibly vulnerable to backpedaling. When capitalists get a whiff of progressive social policies that could hurt their bottom line, like an upcoming set of nationalizations, minimum wage increases, a shortening of the work week, more holidays, public health care, or anything else that makes life better for everyone but makes big companies less money, capital just sits it out and sends the economy into a tailspin. Suffice it to say that governments would prefer to avoid this situation, so progressive legislation is curtailed before it's even started. And in the cases where social democratic states take the gamble and capitalists respond with a strike, social democratic governments find themselves unable to take control of the production process themselves and are forced to appease capitalists by screwing over workers and imposing austerity politics. What's great about this process, from the capitalist point of view, is that it happens almost automatically. In a capitalist economy, the government always has to make sure that its economy is hospitable to profit-making, and therefore investment. This means that capitalists don't necessarily need to be occupying government positions or even be conscious of what they're doing. They just need to know that if the government does something they don't like, they can put their money elsewhere or stop investing. And the government knows that if it does something that lowers investments, their economy might suffer. Each actor can act with relative autonomy from one another, but because they are doing so within the same set of rules, maximizing profits for the capitalist class, they'll often naturally come to an agreement that keeping poverty around and forcing people into mind-numbing work most days of the week and most waking hours of the day is what's best for the economy. Add to that fact that capitalists can influence the government more directly by becoming elected members within it comparatively easily, financing the campaigns of people who are friendly to their interests, or owning mass media institutions that parrot their talking points, and you realize how vulnerable social democracy is by keeping capitalist power around. Not to belabor the point, but 1% of people holding the other 99% hostage by threatening to stop financing the economy when things don't go their way isn't democracy. In contrast, the socialist response of running the economy without capitalists by bringing investment into democratic hands avoids this problem domestically. Socialists still run into the problem of what to do about international capital, but this is something that can be solved by the collaboration of multiple socialist economies, so it's not insurmountable. Social democracy, however, has neither the domestic nor the international means to respond to a capitalist backlash. And this isn't just a theoretical weakness of social democracy. It's been seen in practice many times, and we're even seeing it today.
Hey, you wanna order some Taco Bell? Two grilled chicken burritos.
Back in the 80s, for example, France elected François Mitterrand to be its president. Mitterrand sailed into the presidency on the promise of being a radical social democrat, bringing the mixed economy model to France with the surprising backing of the Communist Party. He did all the things I listed earlier: raised the minimum wage, nationalized a few industries, gave people more holidays and a shorter work week, raised pensions, invested in high-speed rail, all sorts of good stuff that made people's lives meaningfully better almost overnight. But just 2 years in, capital responded. Foreign and domestic investments dried up, and Mitterrand had to completely reverse course in what was called the austerity turn. Multiple nationalized industries were reprivatized, public spending on things like Social Security was massively cut, and new taxes were imposed on workers. It was a brutal blow to the French working class, and a total betrayal of the promises that Mitterrand got elected on.
Really?
And Sweden's gone down the same path, just a bit more slowly and more recently. To quote a 2016 article in Forbes, just so you know I'm not using socialist sources here, over the past 2 decades, the country has undergone a transformation built on deregulation and budget self-restraint with cuts to Sweden's welfare state. Sweden's government shrank jobless and disability benefits to encourage employment. The lower benefits allowed for tax cuts. The inheritance tax was scrapped in 2005, and the wealth tax was canned 2 years later. The result? Inequality in Sweden has skyrocketed. Quoting not from Forbes this time, in 2002, Sweden's top 1% owned 18% of all household wealth. By 2017, it had risen to 42%. And, quote, the country's poorest 30% have no net wealth at all, merely net debts. This is what makes the difference between social democracy and socialism. At any given time, the economy can crumble not because of a natural disaster, a global pandemic, a sudden shortage, a war, a military coup, or a lost election, but just because things got too good for everyday people and they weren't as exploitable as before. To resist these tendencies takes tremendous political will, tremendous social engagement, and extremely high unionization. Things that can be chipped away at for years by capitalists and that can easily go out the window when the end of the month is looking lean. It's not that social democracy isn't better than what we're currently living through in the US. It undeniably is. Making the US follow the Nordic model would ease the burden on millions of people overnight. The problem is that if we ever get that, it will always contain within itself the seeds of its own destruction, and will demand from us that we continue to brutally exploit our fellow human beings on the other side of the world. This doesn't mean socialism is better by default. I'll let my other videos and those of other great creators on this website make the case for that. But when it comes to these problems, socialism has the answer. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that my channel is only possible thanks to my patrons on Patreon. As some of you may remember, I used to make general interest science videos. I didn't particularly enjoy it, but it was easy to get sponsors for that kind of content. When I made the switch to political content, something I actually do enjoy, most of my sponsors bailed. It's understandable, not many brands want to associate with anti-capitalist content, but that means I've had to rely more heavily on the generosity of viewers like you. I've got one reliable sponsor left, and it's a little nerve-wracking not to have much predictable income to count on. If you're able to chip in even $1 a month, I would greatly appreciate the support. As a little show of that appreciation, every patron, regardless of donation amount, gets early access to every video, plus access to our patrons-only Discord server. It's a great place to hang out. We've got everything from a recommended reading list, to a book club, to countless other channels to chat, learn, and explore your interests. We've built a great little community, and we'd love for you to be part of it. So if you'd like to help keep this channel afloat and get some great perks while you're at it, consider becoming a patron by visiting patreon.com/secondthought. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my other content by following the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.
Next one. Why the US is not a democracy.
This is an opinion you can trust from Rhonda Schwab, the owner of a BBB-accredited kayak repair shop. Rhonda connected with Better Business Bureau, and now customers know they can count on her to keep their boats afloat.
BBB for me is an essential part of business. I want my customers to know that they can trust me. If I knew someone who was getting ready to start a business, part of it is the Better Business Bureau, so that they can build their credibility with their customers and with the community.
Be like Rhonda. Build confidence in your business with BBB.
This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Sign up using the link below and get free access to Nebula, where you can watch my original series, The New F Word. Episode 3 is available right now. The US isn't a democracy, it's a plutocracy. And most Americans agree. Today, we're talking about so-called liberal democracy. Let's start with the definition. Democracy comes from this ancient Greek word, and translates to either rule by the people or rule of the people. This definition is a little bit vague, so for centuries various thinkers have come in with slightly different wordings for the same idea. For example, you might be familiar with Lincoln's slightly expanded definition, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But there is truly a huge variety of definitions of democracy, all with their own unique prefixes and caveats. Ultimately, most definitions of democracy, whether they're trying to be universal or sketching out a more precise set of political institutions, are an attempt to realize the sovereignty of the largest group of people possible for any given society. Democracy is an attempt to give people the ability to decide what their lives and their society should look like, in contrast to a monarchy or a plutocracy, where one or just a few individuals would wield this power. Like any political concept, though, things get complicated when you move from the page to the real world. As with freedom, democracy can't be absolute. A democratic population can't abdicate its own power indefinitely, for example. Otherwise, it would be robbing its future citizens of democratic power. It can't remove decision power from any of its citizens in general, nor can it allow its citizens to remove each other's democratic power. It all gets a bit challenging when upholding one of these ideas conflicts with one of the others, in much the same way that freedom extends only so far as it does not infringe upon the freedom of others, and protecting that can mean limiting freedom in one way to reinforce it in another. The idea behind democracy is that it keeps this sort of stuff in check by ensuring power stays relatively evenly distributed between people. As a result, the decisions made in a democratic society should be reflective of the needs and wants of the population, and should generally be the product of that society's deliberation. But now let's look at the United States. There's a good chance you've seen this graph before. It's taken from a Princeton study on policy outcomes and voter preference, and it's one of the most direct pieces of evidence for the US's so-called democratic deficit. On the horizontal axis, you have the public support for any given policy, and on the vertical axis, you have the likelihood that this policy gets passed by Congress. In an ideal situation, the two should meet in the middle. If 100% of the public supports something, for example, there should be a 100% chance of Congress passing it, and vice versa for a policy that 0% of people support. But that's not what the graph shows. Using a set of nearly 2,000 policies across 2 decades, the authors of the study find that for the bottom 90% of the population, support for any given policy has no influence whatsoever on the likelihood of that policy getting passed. The line is flat. Regardless of whether the bottom 90% want something to happen or not, there is no difference in the chances of Congress passing a bill about it. But that's not true for everyone. For the top 10%, their support, or lack thereof, is critical. Congress more or less follows the interests of this wealthier group much more consistently, with the line for the top 10% of society looking a lot closer to the ideal scenario. When our country's economic elites don't want something to happen, it doesn't. And when they do, they have much better odds than the majority of the population. It's as simple as that. Your vote only helps pick which part of the wealthy population has a say. So far, this isn't all that surprising. Like we saw in that bar graph earlier, most Americans have gotten accustomed to the idea that the government doesn't represent the interest of the majority, nor does it adequately cater to the needs of various disenfranchised groups. People know who benefits from the way our government acts, hence why the slogan, "Get money out of politics," has strong support on both the left and the right alike. And while this is good, what's typically missing from the slogan is a clear understanding of exactly why the US has this bias. Getting money out of politics is great, but the US's democracy problem has a much more fundamental core. What is missing for democracy in this country isn't a few campaign finance reforms, or some guy coming in and draining the swamp. Nor do we need less government. The problem is far more structural than could be fixed by any of these ideas. No, the US will never be democratic so long as it's based on the existing constitution and sticks with a capitalist economy. What makes America undemocratic isn't just money in politics, but the structure of the government and the economy themselves. First, while we tend to think of representative government and democracy as synonymous, that is a relatively new idea. For most of history, representative government, like the kind the US has, was thought of as the opposite of democracy, not as the best way to put democracy into practice. This is because representative governments have the benefit of favoring those that are good at getting elected, or have the means to run an electoral campaign, or can curry favor with the right people. Representative governments can be molded to favor some people over others, by cutting up representation along geographic lines, for example, or setting rules that keep more radical voices out, like with age restrictions or a lack of proportionality. Throughout history, elites have therefore always favored representative systems when revolutions were pushing countries down the democratic route. Better to accept some democratic concessions, like universal suffrage, but contain them within institutions that could still be regulated by those who would otherwise be dethroned. Representative government was seen by the elites that came out on top as a way to quell the general public and filter its interests through their own, ensuring that the democratic zeal of the population wouldn't carry the revolution to the point of upsetting their newly achieved status. Founding Father James Madison actually put this anti-democratic nature of representative government in relatively explicit terms when writing the Federalist Papers, saying he preferred this model of government because it would, quote, refine and enlarge the public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens.
If you're a homeowner in Washington and you're still paying for electricity, then I've got some big news for you. Just weeks ago, the federal government passed an extension to the Solar Investment Credit, which pays homeowners an average of $13,000 to install solar panels. What's the catch? Not all homes qualify, but taking our 27-second solar quiz, you'll know instantly if your home does qualify. And that's not even the best part. Not only will this incentive cover 30% of your solar system costs, but this program is $0 down. That's right, you won't pay a penny up front. That's why you've seen so many of your neighbors going solar. So if you want to see how much you can save on electricity this year, then click the button below to take our 27-second solar quiz. Join thousands of homeowners that are saving upwards of 87% on their electric bills with solar. Sound too good to be true? Then put me to the test and take the quiz.
For adventure, for climbing, for splashing, for towing, for premium, for capable. The GMC AT4 lineup, premium and capable. That's professional grade from GMC. Step up to GMC with 2.9% APR and no monthly payments for 90 days on Sierra Light Duty models.
See your Inland Empire GMC dealers.
In other words, representative government actively gets in the way of democracy and favors, unsurprisingly, the representatives themselves and the class interest they may come to represent. In the case of the US, right from its founding, that means favoring the owners of economic property, merchants and large landowners, who only made up a tiny minority of the American people. This class allegiance between government representatives and those with property was baked into the new government the US founded, with the Constitution protecting things like private property, the private ownership of productive resources like factories, farms, and businesses. Because the Founding Fathers knew that if given democratic power over more than a narrow set of issues, people's first instinct would be to dispossess the capitalist elite that was slowly gaining power in America and redistribute economic power amongst themselves, the people who actually do the work. As a result, the system of checks and balances that the Founding Fathers developed was organized not to increase democracy, but to protect the interests of this newly powerful bourgeoisie with things like the Senate, the Electoral College, the President, and the Supreme Court, tempering the most democratic body of the American government, the House, and the American people more generally. The Founding Fathers created this idea that the general public was too dumb to govern itself. That way, the new government and society they would create would guarantee the status they either had or hoped to achieve as owners of property, which in some cases meant literally guaranteeing their right to own people. And liberalism, with its commitment to property and the resulting anti-democratic privileges, would provide the theoretical backing for this new governmental philosophy. Although these systems are undoubtedly more democratic than the hereditary systems they replaced, they were still heavily limited in their attempt to reach the democratic ideal by the founders themselves. And it showed. It took centuries of tireless efforts and multiple uprisings against this system for the power of women and Black Americans to even be considered valid. Same with the violent strikes and protests by militant labor unions that earned all of us basic self-determination, with the weekend, the 8-hour workday, and vacation time. The original construction of the American government gave no democratic outlet for these policies to arise organically within its halls, regardless of popular support. It took tremendous democratic pressure from outside the liberal system in order for the American public to actually make change happen. And at the core of this issue of democracy is the capitalist system itself and the fact that our liberal governments treat politics and the economy as if they were two completely separate things, in the process allowing the economy to be governed by its own authoritarian laws. Take work, for example. At work, you have very little say about incredibly important things. You aren't sitting with the board of directors calling the shots on strategy for the next quarter. You don't elect your boss. You don't decide the safety of your working conditions. Rarely do you have a say in your working hours, and you aren't privy to things like how the company spends its money, especially on things like the salary of the people making those decisions. Most of the decisions about how a business is run, including those that affect you at a personal level, are made by someone else. Someone who is unelected and who undoubtedly has more money and power than you. They will make decisions that serve their interests at your expense, knowing full well that because you need food, water, shelter, and healthcare, and you can be fired at any time, you won't fight back and risk losing your salary. You can choose to quit, but it'll take a lot to get you to that point, and this lets the capitalist make just about any decision they want. The same is true across the entirety of the economy. What dictates economic decisions are not the needs of the people whom the economy is both by and for, but the profit motive. If something horrible is profitable, even if everyone but a handful of elites oppose it, that horrible thing will continue. That's the case with fossil fuel extraction. At the same time, something that is necessary for millions of people may not happen at all if it isn't profitable, like feeding everyone. Feeding the poor is never going to be as profitable as overproducing for the wealthy. While democracy seeks to even out the power among society and make sure that people aren't able to coerce one another into acting against their own interests, capitalism structures society into a hierarchy, with more money giving people more power over others, and therefore the ability to serve their self-interests and punish entire sections of the population far beyond what a democratic body would allow. Ultimately then, capitalists are terrified of working people having as much power as they do, and luckily for them, the capitalist system isn't built to funnel money and power downwards. It's built to concentrate both in fewer and fewer hands. Whatever democracy may exist in some idealized primitive capitalist system that libertarians love to talk about will eventually be washed away by the mergers and acquisitions that centralize capitalist power. When we on the left prioritize democracy and emphasize it so much, this is why. The capitalist system cannot do anything but corrupt democracy, whether that's by influencing government through lobbies, think tanks, and direct infiltration, or by constructing a separate realm of human life where democracy doesn't apply, the economy. Even though this mythical economy is where you spend most of your waking hours, and that decides the money you make for food, the price of shelter, and whether you get to keep your teeth or not, it is subject to the decisions of the market and the capitalists who occupy positions of power within it, not to democratic forces.
Come to TurboTax and don't do your taxes. Meet with an expert who will do them for you, so you can do not taxes.
It isn't just that our governments disempower the public through gerrymandering, or voter ID laws, or privately financed electoral campaigns. At the end of the day, the most determinant aspect of our lives, the state of the economy, is left up to forces that we know will happily crush the needs and interests of the vast majority of the population to satisfy the greed of a well-positioned few. Our democracies are neither by the people nor for the people. They are by and for the capitalist class. But it doesn't have to be this way. By bringing the economy under democratic control, the pressures felt by everyday people in the workplace can be reduced. So long as there is scarcity, difficult decisions will need to be made, and we won't completely eliminate the everyday stress of human existence. But the artificial stress of creating surplus exclusively for a class of property owners, that we can get rid of. More generally, governments could shift away from the parliamentary democratic model imposed on us centuries ago by slavers and landowners, and instead adopt a style of council democracy, or liquid democracy, to blend elements of representative government for those who prefer to temporarily delegate power, with more direct democracy elements for those who prefer to be involved. Workplaces could be run without management entirely, or with a group of managers directly elected by the workers. Constitutions could be drafted and approved by referendums of the general population, like is the case in Cuba and is starting to take shape in Chile. Positions within democratic institutions could be assigned by lottery, the way jury duty is, or by any number of other methods to ensure a more decent representation of the population. Central aspects of the economy could be planned or otherwise controlled to ensure that basic necessities are available to all, preventing people from using the threat of taking them away as coercion. There are countless ideas that could increase the democracy of our country, that could submit necessary decisions of collective need to collective deliberation, while ensuring personal decisions remain guaranteed. But at the end of the day, a society in which the freedom to exploit is guaranteed to those with property can never be a democracy. The New F-Word is a Nebula original series that explores the origins, characteristics, and resurgence of fascism around the world. Instead of taking the History Channel approach of focusing on the battles and leaders of World War II, the New F-Word focuses on the ideology of fascism itself. Where did it come from? What is it responding to? And how can we identify fascism when it appears in the world today? Wherever you stand on the political spectrum, being able to speak knowledgeably about this dangerous ideology is critical, and the New F-Word will give you the tools to do that. The first 3 episodes are available right now on Nebula. What you just saw is a little teaser for my Nebula original series, The New F-Word. I'm really proud of how it's coming along so far, and you can expect 1 episode per month for the remainder of the series. This show wouldn't have been possible without the support of CuriosityStream, who have supported Nebula's efforts since day one. CuriosityStream is an established streaming platform with a solid track record of caring about great educational content and the financial security of those who produce it. They've got thousands of nonfiction titles from some of the best filmmakers in the game. As I've shared with you all many times before, YouTube doesn't treat its creators very well, especially channels with content like mine. That's why some of my creator friends and I teamed up to build Nebula, so we don't have to worry about demonetization. We're also super happy to be able to offer you this bundle deal and get you all access to Nebula basically for free. Nebula is home to content from all your favorite YouTubers, all completely ad-free. Between the 2 platforms, there really is something for everyone. And by signing up at the link below, you're helping us produce more content like my original series, The New F-Word, which YouTube would never allow on its platform. Give CuriosityStream a shot, and get free access to Nebula when you sign up using the link below. It really does help support my channel and educational creators all across YouTube. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my...
I'm gonna go this one.
This episode is brought to you by Audible. Get your first month absolutely free when you sign up using the link below. Almost every discussion of capitalist realism starts with either a description of a book, a movie, or with a quote. So here's all 3 at the same time. In the movie The Usual Suspects, Kevin Spacey's character quotes French writer Charles Baudelaire when he says, "The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist." Capitalism works the exact opposite way. Today, capitalism is the only thing that exists. For the last 30+ years, nothing but capitalism has ever been allowed space in the public consciousness. We live in a time where there's a, quote, widespread sense that not only is capitalism the only viable political and economic system, but also that it is now impossible even to imagine a coherent alternative to it. It's a feeling about the world that's probably best captured by British PM Margaret Thatcher, who famously said, "There is no alternative," or by political scientist Francis Fukuyama, who declared that we've arrived at the end of history, or even by nominally socialist Labour politician Tony Blair, who said that we live in a post-ideological society, where there is no longer a left-wing or a right-wing management of the economy, only economic policy that works. There are a lot of quotes this episode. Capitalist realism is this idea that we've hit the end of the line in terms of economic models, and now politics can be about making the terminus look a little nicer. And it's not hard to see just how hegemonic that feeling is. Just earlier this year, when baby formula shortages triggered a countrywide scramble, Mayor Pete had his own little capitalist realism moment, for example. He said, quote, "This is a capitalist country. The government does not make baby formula, nor should it. Companies make formula." For Pete, the very idea that even in a crisis, anything but a market solution to a problem could be suggested was inconceivable. Like he said, it's just not what capitalist countries do. And capitalist realism is a feeling that's inside us as much as it's in political discourse. Almost every week on this channel, I will critique some aspect or consequence of the capitalist economic model. And almost every week, I'll see a well-intentioned comment saying something to the effect of, "Capitalism might be flawed or even downright cruel, but at the end of the day, it's the best we've got. After all, hasn't everything else been tried and failed?" For most generations growing up after the 80s, our political imagination begins and ends with capitalism. Hardly anyone defends it wholesale, but while capitalism can certainly be resisted, critiqued, and even modified, there is a deep-seated belief within most of us who have lived through the neoliberal era that while capitalism has some wiggle room, it can't actually be overcome. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. This week, we're going to focus on that idea for a while. We're going to look at how capitalist realism gets anchored in society, what political purpose it serves, and how we can try to overcome it and actually have a little bit of freedom in our political and economic imagination. First, we should talk about how we're all poisoned with this idea. And the place to start is with the death of alternatives. hardly anyone thinks capitalism is really handling the world all that well. The global wealth gap keeps growing, environmental collapse is more likely each and every year, social services keep getting gutted, and we live in a perpetual state of economic crisis, recession, or inflation depending on the year. Things are pretty bad, and there are clear ways in which an economic model that seeks growth and profit at all costs, backed up by the most powerful governments in the world, at the very least seriously contributes to the mess we're in. But still, in the back of your mind, some part of you can't really imagine anything better. French philosopher Alain Badiou probably captured this aspect of capitalist realism the best, saying, quote, "We live in a contradiction, a brutal state of affairs, profoundly inegalitarian, where all existence is evaluated in terms of money alone, is presented to us as ideal. To justify their conservatism, the partisans of the established order cannot really call it ideal or wonderful. So instead, they have decided to say that all the rest is horrible. Sure, they say we may not live in a condition of perfect goodness, but we're lucky that we don't live in a condition of evil. Our democracy is not perfect, but it's better than the bloody dictatorships. Capitalism is unjust, but it's not criminal like Stalinism. We let millions of Africans die of AIDS, but we don't make racist nationalist declarations like Milosevic. We kill Iraqis with our airplanes, but we don't cut their throats with machetes like they do in Rwanda." End quote. If things are bad, at least we should be grateful that they could be worse. And this is a very effective rhetorical strategy, because with this perspective we adopt over years of repetition, even critiques of capitalism can end up reinforcing capitalist realism. Since all the alternatives have been painted as so irredeemably, inexcusably evil, so devoid of complexity or reason, so one-sided and deterministic, when we criticize capitalism, supposedly the best system of all, we are actually digging an even deeper hole for everything else. After all, if capitalism can be this awful, just imagine how hellish anything else must be. And that's only one part of the way capitalist realism becomes normalized and so ingrained in our minds. For capitalism to have this kind of unquestionable status as the only viable economic system, we're not just told it's the best we have, it's even more fundamental than that. It's just the way the world works. Capitalism isn't even the best choice between a rock and a hard place. It's not a choice at all. It's natural. Resisting it is as pointless as trying to resist the laws of physics. There are a million different ways this idea manifests, but probably the most famous one is that capitalism is little more than a reflection of human nature. It's often repeated that humans are naturally greedy, naturally competitive, naturally selfish, like all other animals, and therefore, nothing but capitalism could ever coexist with human nature. It's an idea that stems from two things: a really vague description of capitalism being the only economic system with things like competition or self-interest, and the idea that human nature and the natural world more generally only reward one thing: competition. But let's quickly dismiss both these ideas.
Washington State residents, if you have a utility meter like this on the side of your house, you could get...
Capitalism is a specific economic system with specific criteria, and it's only existed for a very short time. It's not competition, greed, markets, freedom, or any other vague one-word definition. Capitalism can be distinguished from previous and future economic models by at least three things. 1. The existence of capital. In simple terms, money with the primary purpose of growth, instead of money that's just a method of accounting or exchange, for example. 2. Private property. The ownership by single individuals of the means of economic production, meaning things like factories, businesses, farms, and so on are owned privately instead of collectively, and are therefore subjected to the decisions of the necessarily outnumbered class that owns them. And 3. Wage labor. The class without private property sells its labor to the class with private property for a wage. Markets, competition, self-interest, and so on all existed long before capitalism, and there's a good chance they'll exist after. But they do not define it. Otherwise, we'd have a really imprecise and impractical definition. Now the second part of that equation. Competition and greed aren't uniquely natural or the defining feature of human nature. You've certainly heard Darwin's theory of evolution being described with the sentence, survival of the fittest. And while evolution is a matter of scientific fact, this specific framing of evolution being the product of competition, with the intentional slip-up between two definitions of fittest, is neither neutral nor scientific. When Darwin was writing about evolution, he wasn't doing it in a vacuum. Highly influenced by the writings of economist Thomas Malthus, Darwin saw in evolution the features of a capitalist economy he was reading about at the time, and framed his writing with that in mind. It's not some accident that defenders of capitalism find its features in the Darwinist explanation of evolution. It was written with capitalism in mind. This is not to say that competition isn't a feature of the natural world, nor is it absent from so-called human nature, but it is clearly not the only thing that drives how the world works. As the anarchist Peter Kropotkin observed in ants, bees, birds, rodents, ruminants, monkeys, and plenty of other species, quote, "As soon as we study animals, we at once perceive that though there is an immense amount of warfare and extermination going on amidst various species, and especially amidst various classes of animals, there is at the same time as much, or perhaps even more, of mutual support, mutual aid, and mutual defense amidst animals belonging to the same species, or at least to the same society. Sociability is as much a law of nature as mutual struggle. And it's not just animals. Humans are selfless all the time. People, without thought, payment, or self-interest, jump in rivers to save total strangers from drowning, create mutual aid networks, and collaborate with no expectation of equivalent return. If greed is a natural part of how humans and nature work, so is selflessness. The existence of greed is not reason enough to build an economy that rewards it. To put it another way, only observing humans under capitalism and concluding it's in our nature to be greedy is the equivalent of only observing us underwater and concluding it's in our nature to drown. Yet still, if capitalism survived all this time, we're told it's because it's just the natural order of the world. So many explanations of the success of capitalism in becoming hegemonic when alternative economic models, specifically socialism, have failed, have this manifest destiny kind of logic to them. The development of capitalism, when you listen to its advocates, rarely acknowledges historical circumstances, like the geographic isolation of the first countries where capitalism took root, or the success of liberal revolutions, the absence of global ideological and economic competitors during the period of initial development, the support of the feudal monarchical order that preceded it, the coinciding technological developments that allowed for the enslavement of an entire continent's labor in the process of primitive accumulation, or the crushing of socialist projects in coups, assassinations, invasions, and wars in economically and militarily less developed states. Instead, the simple explanation that's repeated ad nauseum is that capitalism works because it's the way the world works. Sometimes gorillas punch each other, and that's why you deserve to be poor. This natural explanation is totalizing. It has no logical limits, and it leads to thinking of everything in terms of capitalism and business. Here, Trump is probably the best example of this, with his 2016 campaign taking capitalist realism to its logical endpoint by saying he would run the government like a business. Embedded in that sentence is the idea that the logic of businesses, markets, profit-seeking, and so on naturally lead to the most desirable outcomes in any situation. And you can add onto this list of the ways capitalist realism functions the equally widely disseminated idea that it's just simple pragmatism to believe in capitalism. Everything else is gross and ideological means bad. And to make that point, here's a quote from the raccoon of ideology himself, Slavoj Žižek. At this point, we reach the supreme irony of how ideology functions today. It appears precisely as its own opposite, as a radical critique of ideological utopias. The predominant ideology today is not a positive vision of some utopian future, but a cynical resignation, an acceptance of how the world really is, accompanied by a warning that if we want to change it too much, only totalitarian horror can ensue. Altogether, these different narratives try to establish the idea that capitalism is neutral in its existence, that it is welded to the structure of reality. Socialism or communism, those are imposed on top of the real world. They're just ways to try and change the world away from how it really is, to impose an ideology on reality. Not capitalism, though. Capitalism is reality. It's neutral. It's not ideological. It's just how the world works.
It's hard to get a strong signal of candidate skills when you can't see how they will actually.
And the benefit of capitalist realism is just how successfully it shields capitalism from crisis. Crises are a regular feature in any society, but capitalism has a built-in mechanism that leads it to crisis every 5 or 10 years. The competing logic of reducing costs and increasing sales almost always leads to a crisis of overproduction under capitalism, where, over time, workers don't make enough money to participate in the economy at a rate that keeps profits coming in. Regardless, whether it's a mostly internal crisis like that of overproduction, or one triggered by a relatively unpredictable event like a global pandemic, crises are often moments where capitalism comes into the foreground and faces the risk of being challenged. The benefit of capitalist realism in these moments is that it suppresses the revolutionary idea of transitioning away from capitalism to another economic model, and favors explanations of the crises that don't mention capitalism. If capitalism is the ground that the world is built on, not an economic model that we can decide if we want to keep, it will never be questioned. And fascism in particular is an ideology that benefits from this aspect of capitalist realism, since it works by attributing any problem in society not to a structural feature of that society, but to its corruption by some outside group of quote-unquote wrong kind of people. To quote Todd McGowan, fascism views the crisis as an anomaly that one might repair, while emancipatory politics sees the crisis as the moment at which capitalism reveals the truth of its distortion. And just to be clear, here repair is very euphemistic. Repair to a fascist means killing, deporting, or imprisoning those whose identity has been selected as the cause of the distortion and crisis. Capitalist realism can quite literally stop us from seeing the root of some of our problems, and can either lead us only to band-aid solutions or genocidal cataclysms. So how do we combat this idea that capitalism is all there is? Well, there are a couple ideas. The first, from Mark Fisher, is to demystify concepts like the economy. We made the economy up. We can choose to make it work another way. We are allowed to question the rhetoric that says things like austerity, inflation, and recessions are out of our control. They're not. We don't always have to be on the back foot. We can anticipate these things and control the economy in a democratic way. Same goes for ideas like privatization. There's nothing mandatory about privatizing a government service. Not everything can or should be run for profit. Not everything can be put up for sale. There isn't a market for everything. And the purpose of human government isn't to turn over more and more of our existence to capitalist forces. And finally, we need to build an alternative, a communist realism. In Mark Fisher's words, the concept of communist realism also suggests a particular kind of orientation. This isn't an eventualism, which will wager all its hopes on a sudden and final transformation. It isn't a utopianism, which concedes anything realistic to the enemy. It is about soberly and pragmatically assessing the resources that are available to us here and now, and thinking about how we can best use and increase those resources. It is about moving, perhaps slowly but certainly purposively, from where we are now to somewhere very different. In case you couldn't tell from all the quotes, this episode was inspired by Mark Fisher's phenomenal work, Capitalist Realism. If you enjoyed this week's episode and you'd like to learn more about just how ingrained this notion of capitalist realism is in our modern society, I highly recommend you check it out. I try my best to learn and understand as much as I can about topics like these so that I can explain them the way I wish I could have had them explained to me back when I was first learning about this stuff. And my personal favorite way to do that is by listening to fascinating audiobooks on Audible. I struggle to sit down and read a book, but with Audible, I can get through my very long list of titles, all while running errands, or working out, or tidying my perpetually messy office. I just finished listening to Capitalist Realism again, and I cannot stress enough just how critical it's been in helping me wrap my head around this topic. There's seriously no better place to start, in my opinion. As an added bonus, when you sign up for Audible using my link, you get to pick a free audiobook every month. Yours to keep even if you cancel your subscription. Listening to Audible has completely changed how I learn. If you enjoyed this week's topic, I highly recommend you check out Capitalist Realism on Audible. It's a fantastic listen. So if you want to help support my channel so I can produce more
And I bumped into one of my brother's friend's mom, and she was just so thrilled that he had graduated this boot camp and then found a job and was really changing up his life. That's what initially put the thought in my head of like, I could learn to code, I could really do this. I was interested in building websites when I was looking for boot camps, and Practicum Software Engineering Program seemed like a place where I could learn how to do that. One of the things that helped me most become the engineer I am today is the project-based sprints. I worked on a project for an angel investor who needed a full stack project from end to end to be able to create an MVP and show potential investors of its own a real world project. I wanted to work somewhere.
This episode is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Sign up using the link below and get free access to Nebula, where you can watch my original series, The New F Word. For a lot of Americans, the word socialism means the government coming in and taking your stuff. But having your personal property taken away is a feature of capitalism, not socialism. More and more, our economy is shifting away from personal ownership and towards rent, with the most popular explanations and trends blaming it on millennials' preferences or actively encouraging it. Before we get started, just a quick refresher. Socialists are opposed to private property, not personal property. That terminology is dumb and confusing and an endless source of headache. And all it means is that socialists want collective ownership of the means of economic production, meaning businesses, farms, factories, stores, and so on, and couldn't care less about your toothbrush, your car, your guitar, or anything else you own. We want an end to an economic model where a single individual can have their name on a piece of paper, own a company, and have the final say on how it's operated while their workers who actually make the company productive don't. It's got nothing to do with what's in your house. Private property is bad, personal property is good. That's it. Here's a video I did if you want to learn more about that. In any case, while capitalism is usually upheld as the champion of property rights, that really only applies to private property. Neoliberal governments will fight tooth and nail to make sure capitalists don't have their private ownership threatened in any way, shape, or form. But when it comes to personal property, there are no such guarantees. And you probably already intuitively know this. Personal ownership is slowly being taken off the table for more and more stuff. We just don't have the option for true ownership for an increasing chunk of our personal property. The most obvious example in our everyday lives is probably media. Stuff like movies and music. Although vinyl records are having a bit of a comeback, that's nothing compared to the vast majority of people in the US who have given up on owning music and switched to streaming on apps like Spotify and Apple Music. From the physical world to the digital world, we've switched away from ownership entirely. These services run on subscription models first and foremost, meaning nothing is ever really owned. The monthly fee you pay only guarantees temporary access. And it's not inherently a bad thing, it just is more convenient. But this shift away from ownership isn't limited to subscription services or simply a more convenient arrangement. If you have a Kindle, you might have bought an ebook before and assumed that because the button you clicked on said buy, that you actually owned it in digital format. But you don't. If you've ever read the end user license agreement, which, come on, you'll have seen that it says, quote, Kindle content is licensed, not sold to you. Meaning at any given time, Amazon could revoke your access to the books you've supposedly bought. And it's not just Kindles. More and more, we've seen how the model of ownership we're all accustomed to, where we buy something and once it's in our possession, it's ours to do with whatever we want, has started being chipped away. John Deere tractors now run proprietary software that doesn't allow operators to repair them, and forces them to go to John Deere approved retailers for anything from repairs, to upgrades, to modifications. And if you've ever owned a Keurig K-Cup machine, you'll know that the coffee machine software only lets you brew with Keurig authorized coffee. It's a problem so ridiculous that you need to buy a so-called freedom clip to make your own coffee in your own coffee machine. That's not usually how owning things works. Now, these examples are a bit silly, but the trend of personal ownership being challenged affects much more important things than ebooks and coffee. It's a problem that affects big things, like housing. In the US, the home ownership rate is around 66%. That number doesn't sound so bad, but that's until you put it into context. Over the last 70 years, fewer and fewer people are getting a chance to actually own their homes. Back in the old days, 70% of those born in the 1940s owned a home by the time they were 35. Now, that number is down to 50% for millennials born in the 80s. and it's only getting worse for younger generations. Every year, homeownership gets delayed further and further, and as a result, we spend more years renting, if not our entire lives. More time paying off our landlord's mortgages without ever owning the property ourselves. It's a problem that drains people's finances for years on end, and is one of the biggest roadblocks to having a stable economic and living situation. Needing to constantly worry about homelessness lurking around the corner should shockingly few things go wrong isn't a great way to live. And yet it's what renting implies for millions of people in a country with no universal housing guarantee. Not wanting to buy a home and preferring to rent is fine. That's not the problem here. The problem is that ownership isn't actually available as a choice for that many people, and there's no guaranteed alternative. It's rent, with all its problems, or it's nothing. But this problem with ownership follows most people even once they've stopped renting. Homeowners aren't always actually homeowners because most people in the homeowners category are still paying back their mortgages. Or, said differently, today, around 60% of these quote-unquote homeowners are still renting, just from the bank instead of a landlord. And at the end of the day, it's the bank's house until you've paid your loan back. Miss enough payments and the bank will happily make that clear. And there's a unifying trend here. Although a rental-based model of consumption isn't inherently bad for everything, it's not black and white, nor is it happening throughout the entire economy, there is something to be said about the ways in which personal ownership is being challenged today. Despite some people predicting, or even outright wishing for an economy where you're completely dependent on rent-based consumption, there are obviously limits on how far that can actually go, and pros and cons that depend on what kind of consumption and ownership we're talking about. For something like housing, for example, renting has obvious disadvantages. A lack of security at the whims of the bank or the landlord, a regular drain on at least a third of your income, a lack of a stable asset from which to build a secure financial situation for the rest of your life, and of course the depressing reality of just having to deal with your landlord. But for something like music, renting might just be more useful. The thing is that simply focusing on the pros and cons of each kind of consumption misses the bigger picture. What's behind this growth in rent-based consumption is a natural tendency of capitalism. Most of us are getting poorer. We can't help but to rent. Or at least that's a big part of the explanation.
Welcome to my favorite store ever. Yes. Love this, need that. More? Now we're cooking. So cute. What? $9.99. $12.99? No way.
How could you not?
Getting this. Wow.
Wow.
Okay.
Why should you tap? Learn more below and take the free Washington Solar Home Survey. Great question. Listen up, because this info will save you thousands. In August, Congress passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which pays homeowners an average of $13,000.
While advocates of capitalism like to boast about its ability to lift people out of poverty, the reality is that this is only true for a very short time, if ever. Over time, poverty can only increase under a capitalist economy. That's because the logic of profit-seeking demands that capitalists do two contradictory things: increase their profits and cut their costs. On the face of it, there's no reason these two things can't go together. But the problem is that most productive industries rely on human labor for at least part of the process. Relying on human labor means paying out wages. But when you're in a constant competition for a higher profit margin, the incentive is to find a way to exploit your workers more and more. Whether that means cutting their wages, working them longer hours, increasing productivity with technology or through a different management style, any way to get more out of your workers than your competition, and of course more money than you're paying them, is on the table. The problem here is that this inevitably leads to crises. Over time, with profits increasingly funneled upwards towards the owners of capital, less of the wealth that is produced reaches the workers. And that's a problem because capitalism depends on constantly increasing consumption in order to properly function. What you're left with then is an economy where workers can't afford to pay for the things they make, inequality is on a permanent upward trajectory, and the share of the population that's poor keeps growing. And this isn't just theoretical, it's been happening for decades. The gap between the rich and the poor has been growing since at least the 70s. Recessions, crashes, inflation, and regressive tax policies based on the now debunked trickle-down philosophy have funneled wealth away from the working class and towards the wealthy, and real wages have completely stagnated. with the minimum wage stalling out around $7 an hour when our gains in productivity should have raised it to over $20 by now. The truth is, we can't afford to own that many things anymore. Buying all the movies, TV shows, and songs we listen to is simply out of reach for most people where a subscription isn't. And same goes for rent. The reason people aren't homeowners is because it's just too expensive to be. What we do buy, we often buy with debt. While an endless string of articles has framed this trend as a matter of personal preference, with headlines like, "Why the younger generation doesn't want to own stuff," or "Millennials actually prefer to rent homes than buy them." The reality is that renting is a band-aid for an economy that has killed most people's purchasing power and will continue to do so because it's the only thing it can do. Capitalism works first and foremost for the owners of capital, not workers nor even consumers. What rent allows is the continued profitability of industries that would have gone out of business if they still relied on selling ownership. And it's not simply a matter of technology. Of course, things like the internet allow for services like Netflix to exist, and the developments made in computer chips allow even a simple coffee maker to have a vetting process. But although tech developments may have allowed this model to work, the reason it's flourished is because it's usually cheaper for consumers in the short run and more profitable for capitalists in the long run. For most things that have fallen into this rent-based selling access model, the majority of the population can't help but accept the trade-off between price and ownership. It might not feel right to pay a monthly fee for a video editing software that'll ultimately cost more than outright ownership, but dropping $500 in one go is just not within most people's reach. We might prefer to actually own our books instead of buying a license, but it's just cheaper this way. We might prefer to own our homes instead of spending decades renting, and then another couple decades paying back a mortgage, but buying a place with straight cash just isn't an option. Renting sucks, but it's often the only financially viable move. And although rental-based models are full of trade-offs, they ultimately do share a common problem. Our lack of ownership over the goods we rent leaves them entirely up to the control of their actual owners. In a pretty trivial but nonetheless telling example, you might remember when HBO removed over 30 shows from their streaming platform earlier this year to avoid paying their creators residuals. The owners of those shows decided they were done with them, and suddenly that catalog vanished and became almost entirely inaccessible. It's not the end of the world, but it's worrying that at any moment, perhaps for something more essential than a few shows, part of a rental-based service might suddenly become unprofitable and disappear from people's hands overnight. Some forms of rent used to be the exception, but in many ways they're becoming the norm, and in increasingly critical parts of our lives. And that means that the amount of things we use every day that now falls under the private property label instead of personal keeps growing. And so, even after the point of sale, the decision power of the capitalist class has been extended a little further. And just to be clear, this isn't some kind of plot. There's no ill will guiding us down this path, or any global conspiracy. The logic of the profit motive, of capitalism, simply guides businesses down the path of least resistance. And in an economy where poverty can't help but grow, and new technology and lack of regulation allow stricter controls over ownership by capitalist enterprises, profiting off of rent is the logical path to take. The New F-Word is a Nebula original series that explores the origins, characteristics, and resurgence of fascism around the world. Instead of taking the History Channel approach of focusing on the battles and leaders of World War II, the New F-Word focuses on the ideology of fascism itself. Where did it come from? What is it responding to? And how can we identify fascism when it appears in the world today? Wherever you stand. This episode and others like it are made possible by the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. My AdSense revenue has completely tanked in the last couple months. So if you'd like to help support this channel and get a bunch of cool perks while you're at it, consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/secondthought. What if we stopped working? No, really, what if tomorrow we just didn't clock in? What if every single one of us just stopped, right now, and saw what would happen?
Bikini Bottom is literally in a state of total chaos tonight.
Oh, literally!
The real answer is things would go downhill real fast. It would be, like, so bad,
empty shelves, empty cities, empty promises even. We wouldn't make it very long without anybody doing anything we call work. But that doesn't make what if we stopped working a useless question. Because in an otherwise simple answer, it would suck, there's something a little more interesting hiding in the background, just out of focus. What is that? Enhance. Enhance! If the answer to what if we stopped working is we can't, that begs the question, how close can we get? And that question, well, that question has some pretty interesting answers. Let's back up. If you go to parties, you've probably been asked the question, what do you do? If you answer, I make YouTube videos, no you don't. Who would ever give you the chance to give that answer? See, the joke here is that YouTubers have no friends. Like, no one at all. Like, bottom of the barrel, trapped in a pit of loneliness. Anyway, the fact that what do you do is the default punch bowl question demonstrates at least one thing about our current society. Work is one of, if not the biggest part of our lives. But it doesn't have to be. Already, multiple countries are trying out things like a 4-day work week. How does this work? In countries like New Zealand, Spain, and Iceland, they ran experiments with shortening the work week to just 4 days, and then they wrote down the results, and now we're looking at them. One of the better known cases here is Iceland, which ran a couple experiments between 2015 and 2019 after unions started pushing for more time off. For a lucky 2,500 Icelandists, for a lucky 2,500 people, time on the job was decreased to just 4 days, going from 40 to around 35 hours a week. Crucially, without salaries going down even a single frozen fish, or whatever they use for currency over there. Unsurprisingly, it worked really well. People were happier, less likely to experience burnout, healthier. Overall, they just had a better life. And thanks to the successes of the experiment and the strength of trade unions, over 80% of people in all of Iceland shortened their working hours or gained the right to after these trials were run. Even fancy business people in suits were happier because they got to save on some of their costs and didn't see a dip in productivity. Because, as you might not find very surprising, productivity has a diminishing returns curve. The longer you work, the less productive you are. Each new hour of time on the job brings less and less benefit and is more and more justified in being lopped off entirely. And these sorts of experiments are all well and good, but what if we went even further? This week's episode is a little different. Usually, videos on this channel focus on the bad stuff. We hate bad stuff. Sorry, ignore him, I don't know how he got in here. And no doubt about it, this video is still going to have some of that with a side of political theory to appease the nerds. But for the next 15 or so minutes, we're mainly going to answer a couple questions about work. What it is, why it's such a big deal for some people, and why it could just not be. Because it could. We don't need to work so damn hard. You'd think that that fact would make for easy political points, just right there for the taking. Who wouldn't vote for the candidate or the party that's going to make their lives more pleasant, less constrained, more free of work? And in some countries, they do have that kind of politics. But the reality is that neither major political party here in the US is trying to reduce the time we spend at work.
We have to get back to work. Our people want to work. If they want to go back, they have to go back.
A job's about a lot more than a paycheck. It's about your dignity. It's about respect. It's about your place in the community.
Neither party is trying to meaningfully reduce our working hours, despite enough people hating their jobs so much that Forbes, of all magazines, can run a listicle with 15 ways to, quote, rise above resenting your job, with such helpful tips as, get over it. That's not to say that the sentiment doesn't exist at all in our government. Democrat Mark Takano is trying to get a bill for a 32-hour work week through Congress. But by and large, neither party is anti-work. Should they be? Okay, let's go over some definitions. Despite being an illegal wordle guess, work is actually a word. Work is the effect we have on the world. It's using your physical or mental effort to achieve something. Without any work at all by anyone, we'd all die. Without nurses, electricians, teachers, people getting out of bed to make breakfast, society would crumble pretty quickly. We would be completely idle, and not for long. Some amount of work always needs to be done. Nowadays, some work gets paid with money, and some work gets paid with no money or barely any money, and also disdain. Being against work, or anti-work if you spend any time on the worst place on the internet, isn't ignoring that fact. It's recognizing that some work always needs to be done, but that the conditions that shape that work should be different than they are now. It's saying that the goal shouldn't be to work as much as possible, but as little as possible to achieve what we want. The goal is to maximize leisure and the quality of that leisure by balancing that interest with the necessity of work. The goal isn't to not work at all, but to work for things that matter and on good terms. This is gonna sound really obvious, but for most of us, that's not how work goes. Work is something we need to do to get access to the things we need to live, like food, shelter, and healthcare. Under capitalism, the only way to get these basic necessities of life is to work in some way or another and get a wage at the end. You work or you starve. Seems pretty coercive. While at work, you have no or very little input on your work conditions. Sometimes they're okay, other times not. On top of that, our whole lives are conditioning us for that reality and imbuing it with value. Work will set you free, no pain, no gain, or there's no such thing as a free lunch are some examples of the ideological discourse that accompanies the material reality of coercion and makes it seem more natural, more palatable. Our necessity to work is accompanied by a psychopolitics trying to enshrine work, in the largest possible sense, as a value. But it doesn't seem to work as well as the benefactors of that discourse want it to. When you consider how much of our time we spend thinking about not working, whether it's dreaming up a vacation we want to take, fantasizing about winning the lottery and quitting, or buying an ironic Garfield mug, it seems like we all want to stop working pretty badly. And yet, when we're given the chance, a good chunk of us keep working even when we don't need to. Some billionaires still work, as do many lottery winners. Retirees often volunteer or continue working in some capacity, even when their needs are met and they're supposed to be in the part of their lives where they stop. So, do we like to work, or do we hate it? The obvious answer is that it depends. What does it depend on? Meaning. When we find work meaningful, we're more than happy to do it. And there are a couple ways that work can have meaning. There's the most obvious one, which is that work which allows us to develop our talents and interests, to self-actualize. Then there's work that grants us autonomy and control over the work itself and the product of that work. And of course, there's work that produces something of importance. These kinds of really obvious factors give work meaning, and help explain why people work on things even when they have no need to and could live in complete and total leisure. But unfortunately, in the US and the UK, around a quarter of people feel like their job is completely meaningless. And a big chunk of people on top of that aren't really sure, don't really know if their job is meaningless. They just don't know, they can't figure it out. Which is really to say that their jobs aren't evidently meaningful either. That doesn't mean that every single one of their jobs is entirely pointless. Meaning and purpose are different, even if there's bound to be a big overlap in that group between pointless and meaningless work. But it definitely means that, at the very least, those jobs are alienating. They're jobs that feel bad to do. They're jobs that aren't imbued with meaning. And that's not even the whole picture. Of the 8 to 9 hours spent every day at work by millions of people, between 1.5 and 3 of them are spent on private activities. We might call this wasted time. Not in the sense that it's not good, it's totally fine by me, but in the sense that it's not really the purpose of being at your job. But as you might expect, or are doing right now watching this video, in which case, nice, workers spending that time on personal things are still pretending like they're being productive during these hours of work that aren't quite downtime, but aren't quite work either. It's ridiculous. While part of this rightfully stolen time is a form of worker resistance, the clear majority of it comes from having nothing to do but being stuck at work, forced to keep up the appearance of click-clacking away or calling people who really don't want to talk to you, just because that's what your boss expects. You're not really free to do what you want, but you're not really working either. And when people are working, not committing, quote, time theft, an even bigger number of them are working on pointless, mind-numbing tasks like moving data from one Excel spreadsheet to another, responding to emails, or writing reports for someone to throw in a drawer and never look at. Busy work. The point of all this is that there's a tremendous number of people who do nothing at all day, by their own admission, but still have to do it. There's a true army's worth of people wasting their lives behind computers, standing up for long hours in the same 2 square feet, working through the night. And for what? A great many of them just for the appearance of productivity, or the appearance of luxury. or the appearance of importance, to make someone else feel good and pad their wallet just that little bit more by making sure everyone else knows how very important they are. After all, why would someone who's not important have all those underlings? The cost of this bullshit economy is tremendous. Bullshit workers are being robbed of a life. And we have a terrible response to this fact of modern society. In liberal circles, the idea is to redirect everybody to public works projects, achieve full employment, bringing money into people's hands so they can spend it on goods that recirculate that money into the economy and produce more. Trying to give, quote, dignity to jobs that are clearly just exploitation turned up to 11. On the right, the idea is to pump more money into businesses on the foolish hope that they're going to just create more jobs, or deregulate workers' rights to the extreme so that they can fire everybody into the worst kind of poverty we can conjure up, and pay the lucky few still employed next to nothing. Run the leanest operation possible, Uberize everything, and sell the precarity of unstable, low-paid work without a safety net as choosing your own hours, or being your own boss. Very few people are willing to embrace the most obvious conclusion. A lot of this is unnecessary. We're working too much. If we distribute the workload and the benefits more evenly, we can work a lot less. Politics isn't the only place where myopic conclusions about work are reached. When we get out of the realm of explicitly political discourse, and into the space we arbitrarily separate out as social, the same tropes and attachment to work aren't hard to find. Hustle culture, the rise and grind set, whatever you want to call the ideology juice that gets a millionaire to spend his free time flipping garage sale toys for $15. This modern phenomenon is another way in which this political attachment to the Protestant work ethic gets absorbed into our everyday lives. Another way to try to attach meaning to exploitative work, rather than limit labor to work that is already meaningful and practical. Instead, shaping people's entire identity around turning idle time into another buck. Clearly, we have an abundance of free time right there for the taking. So many people wouldn't feel like their jobs were meaningless if there wasn't some truth to it. So much time at work wouldn't be spent slacking if it couldn't be. The truth is, we've made tremendous progress in terms of productivity over the last 100 years. Automation and industrialization alone have taken some of the more laborious activities we used to call work out of human hands entirely. But in over 80 years, the 40-hour work week hasn't budged. It's not laziness to ask for more time for leisure. It's efficiency. It's purely pragmatic. We accomplish the same amount in a couple hours as it used to take a full day. More on a Monday than used to be possible with most of a week. We automated away many of the things we didn't want to do so that we had the time to do the things that we do want to do. Spending that time we earned creating new jobs where we feel stuck at work for hours on end just because we have no good mechanism to distribute work and protect the unemployed means failing to realize the goals of automation. It is wasting all that progress.
I'm sure you've heard how Grammarly improves your writing, but let me tell you how Grammarly Business helped my company. Look at Simon.
And yes, it's undoubtedly not so black and white. Some of the industrialization and automation of the past century has allowed us to take on new work that does actually improve our quality of life. But focusing exclusively on that to justify useless jobs with the sole purpose of padding some higher-up's wallet and satisfying the doctrine that, well, everybody has to work, is ignoring the main way we could be improving our lives today, making work a smaller part of it. Okay, so what if we tried answering the question, how close can we get to eliminating work, in an unscientific way? If we took the estimate of 25% of people having meaningless jobs at face value, which in all fairness is a stretch, we're eliminating 25% of our work hours. Work weeks go from 40 hours to 32 here in the US. That's not bad. And we don't have to accept the fact that these jobs are actually meaningless to want to reduce the time spent on them. Even if these jobs do have a purpose, the feeling of meaninglessness they create clearly demonstrates that they are incredibly mentally damaging for the people working in them. Reducing those hours, like we would with incredibly physically demanding jobs, makes sense beyond a strict productivity maximization framework. In another example, what if we took that statistic about 1.5 to 3 hours being completely wasted every day? Taking that into account, you end up with somewhere between a 27 and a 33-hour work week. That's also pretty good. And if this seems like an absurd way to calculate how much time we're working, I agree with you. I shouldn't be plucking numbers out of this or that study, doing simple divisions and calling it a day. But this is no less absurd than how we determine work hours right now. Just a couple people at every company write your contract. They set your working hours, with the only limit being what the law says they can't go over, pushing most industries right up to that 40-hour clock out. And the only reason that number isn't any higher is thanks to decades of worker agitation, revolts, protests, demonstrations, other synonyms for people being angry, clawing it from industry. Were it not for the gains of militant workers, we'd still be punching in 12-hour days side by side with newly minted 12-year-olds. This is an absurd way to decide how much work needs to be done, letting a couple guys make all their demands and only tempering them when society faces mass-scale agitation and violence bubbling up in the streets is absurd. It shouldn't get to this point. The clearly better way to determine working time is to work for necessity and desire, to make decisions in common about needs and allocations of resources, to use governments, organizations, and democracy everywhere across the board to establish how much we work and how much we set aside for leisure, to disentangle work from necessity so that we can really make these decisions without constantly fearing for our meals and fighting others for the scraps. In short, to include democracy in economic decisions, to take into account our resources and desire to work without constantly fearing that every drop of sweat we don't shed means worrying about being taken over by the other sweatier worker at the other sweatier company. To stop people who profiteer off the work of others by hogging everyone else's free time. To not have a system that decides how much we work based on how much the guy at the top really wants a new watch. Missed birthdays, funerals, and every other life event in between be damned. Now, this isn't about getting back to some primitive way of life, idealized beyond the reality of tremendous hardship and ableism past societies encountered without the technological and social advancements we have today. This is about taking stock of all the time going straight down the drain for no good reason other than keeping an unjust system chugging along. This is about enjoying a life like we have now with more time to actually enjoy it. If you spent a couple less hours at Best Buy, would society be okay? Or AutoZone, or making coffee, or on the clock in your cubicle? Sure, GDP could go down a bit, but we already know how the GDP gets broken down between the rich and the poor anyway. We wouldn't be maximizing profits and exhausting all the human labor power at our disposal. But that is not the point of being human in the first place. So long as we can reorganize our society towards one in which GDP dips aren't synonymous with austerity for the majority, where we care more about the productive resources at our disposal than the numbers on a screen meant as a proxy of those resources, we can dramatically change the nature of work and how much time we decide to put into it. Even without touching those structures, we can still meaningfully cut our work time. Today, burnout rates are through the roof. More and more people are being pushed into holding multiple jobs. People are desperate for leisure time but can't afford to take it. We as human beings need time to do whatever we want, for everyone. Art, music, reading, going back to school, watching TV shows, playing sports, cooking, being with friends, traveling, volunteering, farming, doing literally nothing, or even working, just on something else. It's within our reach. Our obsession with the ideology of work and the coercive model of decision-making holding our society captive are the only barriers to its achievement. We can build a world where work is rewarding, meaningful, and fair. I'm gonna be honest. YouTube has really been screwing me lately. My AdSense revenue is down to a third of what it was a couple months ago, and subscribers aren't being notified of my uploads. If you'd like to help support content like this, remember to click the bell and select all to make sure you get a notification for each new upload. And if you'd really like to help keep the lights on and you're able to chip in even $1 a month, consider becoming a patron on Patreon. Every patron, regardless of donation amount, gets early access to every video, plus access to our patrons-only Discord server. I do a live Q&A for patrons once a month, and it's always a lot of fun. So if you'd like to join our growing community and help keep my channel afloat, visit patreon.com/secondthought to become a patron. Thank you all so much for your support. I really couldn't do it without you. If you enjoyed this video, consider dropping a like. If you hated it, a thumbs down. You can check out my previous episodes by clicking the links on your screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.
Let's see. What's
Meet
the next one?
Suavecito, the world's finest pomade.
Oh, dude, why corporate America hates you.
This episode is brought to you by GiveWell. American workers are unionizing, and big companies will do just about anything to make sure that doesn't happen.
Starbucks workers in upstate New York who voted to unionize for the first time in the face of strong opposition from management.
The union says the deal includes pay raises of up to 66% over 2.5 years.
A historic vote in New York City. Workers at an Amazon warehouse in Staten Island will unionize, a first in the U.S. in Amazon's 27 years.
It's a great time for unions right now. The win rate for union elections is steadily rising. Strikes are up from last year. And public support for unions is at a 57-year high. While unions only represent a relatively low 10-ish% of the workforce, it used to be around 20% in the 80s and around 30% in the 50s, all signs point to us being at the start of something big. Workers at Amazon, Apple, Chipotle, REI, Starbucks, Trader Joe's, and lots of other companies where unionization once seemed impossible have made headline after headline after headline with unprecedented union victories. And that's really exciting because unions make people's lives so much better. Unions, like the word implies, unite workers together to fight for their collective interests when their employers would rather pit them against one another. And that has massive consequences. A union worker, all else being equal, meaning same education, occupation, and experience, makes 13% more than a non-union worker. And over the course of an entire career, that works out to an extra $1.3 million on average. Union workers are more likely to have employer-sponsored health insurance, and their employer typically pays more of it. Union workers are also more likely to have paid sick leave and vacation, and more of both. More likely to have a retirement plan, and less likely to be fired. Union contracts come with due process protections that stop employers from firing people at will. And multiple studies have found that unionized workplaces are safer, they have fewer workplace accidents, and fewer fatalities. And the benefits of a union don't just go to unionized workers. If unionization goes up in your area or your industry, studies find that your wages will go up too, even if you aren't part of a union, thanks to something called the union threat effect. Basically, your employer, seeing that unionization is possible right next door, is likely trying to avoid it happening at your job by increasing your wages and/or benefits in anticipation. Everybody wins. And it's not hard to see why someone working at, let's say, Amazon might want to join a union. It's not only about the statistics. When a company feels comfortable forcing its employees to work past the point of safe evacuation in a tornado, thereby leading to the death of 6 workers, and threatening its workers to go back to work when they stop because of a warehouse fire, and generally can't tell the difference between these two things, having a union there to stand up to management isn't just a matter of improving things for the long run, it's about saving people's lives and protecting their dignity right now. Unions are great because they take the lopsided power structure of a private business. You do what you're told or you're fired, and they rebalance it. With a union there to strike when management's demands get out of hand, to protect someone from getting unjustly fired, and to get more money, benefits, and protections in everybody's contracts, your boss can't do whatever they want anymore. So, as you might expect, the surge in collective organizing has come with a corresponding surge in union busting.
Washington State residents, if you have a utility meter like this on the side of your house, you could get paid.
Big business owners aren't ready to let go of all the power they've accumulated during the neoliberal era, so they're fighting back as hard as they can. But they won't admit it outright. Public support for unions is way too high and way too widespread for anti-unionism to be good PR. So guys like Jeffy B say that it's all about workers' choices.
We don't believe that we need a union to be an intermediary between us and our employees. But of course, at the end of the day, it's always the employee's choice.
But actions speak louder than words. And when it comes to union busting, Bezos' words are like a whisper in a pillow. And to make that point crystal clear, the rest of this video is just going to be a catalog of all the different union busting strategies we could find, so that you can not only recognize them if they ever apply to you and your workplace, but more generally get a better idea of what employers are willing to do, both legally and illegally, to make sure your voice at their company stays suppressed. For starters, just to give you an idea of scale, US businesses spend $340 million a year on union avoidance advisors alone. In order to avoid paying their workers more, companies are ready to spend around $350 an hour, or $2,500 a day, on lawyers and consultants to come up with union-busting strategies and mine legal documents for ways to punish worker organizations. And the things they come up with can be truly disgusting. The most obvious one is firing the people they think are leading the unionization movement, like what happened at Starbucks stores here, and here, as well as many more locations across the country, amounting to at least 85 workers. Management gets a whiff of unionization, and they'll just start firing the troublemakers. And if you're thinking, that sounds like it should be illegal, it already is. The National Labor Relations Act, or NLRA, makes it illegal for employers to fire workers for trying to unionize. Just like it also makes it illegal to fire everyone at once by shutting down a branch in the process of unionizing, which Starbucks has also coincidentally done at multiple locations. But employers know that, and they don't care. When they want to shut down the union, they'll just skirt the law by finding a BS reason to shut down a store, like citing safety concerns. Or will find a BS reason to fire an employee. For example, suddenly enforcing a technical rule that's never been enforced before, like what happened to this Starbucks employee.
It began on January 25th. 2 Buffalo Starbucks locations had already voted to form a union. Another in Mesa, Arizona was in the process, and the workers were gaining steam within the company and in the press. On this Tuesday afternoon, a Starbucks district manager tried to intimidate 19-year-old Layla Dalton, a Phoenix employee, into quitting. The manager said she was suspending Layla and shutting down the store for the day. Her violation? Layla had texted her direct supervisor. According to an NLRB investigation, the manager began enforcing a previously unenforced rule prohibiting employees from communicating with supervisors by text message. Layla had texted her boss at least 12 times before this incident without any problems, but suddenly she was being suspended for it.
What companies like Starbucks do in these situations is incredibly transparent, but they couldn't care less if they get caught. At worst, the NLRA only requires that an illegally fired employee be given back pay and reinstated. There are no punitive damages or civil penalties, even if the company is found guilty. So firing a worker for trying to unionize is not only easy, it's cheap. It's why employers are charged with violating federal law in 41.5% of all union election campaigns, and why 1 out of 5 union election campaigns involves a charge that a worker was illegally fired for union activity. Breaking the law doesn't really have any consequences, so might as well do it and fire union leaders. Worst case scenario, they get a little money back. And that's assuming businesses even get caught, because the NLRB, the institution in charge of enforcing these laws, is completely overwhelmed and can't possibly monitor every employer's illegal union busting. Funding for the NLRB has not budged in the last 9 years, so inflation has eaten away 25% of its budget, and it's lost 39% of its staff in the last 2 decades. Businesses just aren't worried about breaking the law, and why would they be? Odds are, no one will do anything about it. Now, let's get back to the union busting strategies. Another totally illegal move companies like to pull is threatening to withhold pay raises or benefits from workers trying to unionize, which by now, no one should be surprised to find out, Starbucks did that too. According to an Axios report, Starbucks gave pay raises and benefits to non-union workers while withholding them from stores trying to unionize. And they even gave those same non-union employees extra perks, like more sick time, a looser dress code, and more access to tips. All that to discourage workers from unionizing, which, once again, super illegal and shitty. But there's more. Companies also have no qualms about going the extra mile and straight up spying on their employees to prevent a union from forming. This became increasingly popular during the pandemic, when employers used so-called bossware, which can screenshot the websites you visit, record employees' faces and voices, log their keystrokes, track their location, and even monitor their calls and text messages. That's for the digital side. In the case of Amazon's Whole Foods, management went so far as to use real-life heat maps to track workers' locations and predict which stores were likely to unionize. You know, that very cool, totally normal, not at all dystopian kind of stuff you love to see from your favorite family-friendly grocery store. But as shocking as these examples are, they're just the most sensational tactic that employers use. They're incredibly common, but the tragic reality is that union busting is more often than not a matter of doing perfectly legal harassing and slowly putting more and more pressure on workers until they break. To do that, companies resort to a couple strategies. The most well-known being so-called captive audience meetings. Essentially, perfectly legally, Your boss can force you to attend a meeting where they will spend as much time as they want bad-mouthing the union and intimidating you into voting no to unionization. Employers can discipline or even fire people that refuse to attend these meetings, or that choose to leave early. They can schedule as many of them as they want, and at any time of the day. And all with the only constraint being that they can't do it within 24 hours of a union election. In contrast, workers trying to get a union going aren't allowed to hold meetings on company property, can't take time out of their coworkers' day, and their boss has no requirement to give them a list of the company's employees, so they can't even easily contact everyone. Unions are at a massive disadvantage. And if you're thinking, so what? You probably don't know what these captive meetings can look like.
The meetings have gotten increasingly anti-union. In the beginning, it was kind of like, let's talk about what makes you love Starbucks. And then it got more and more, the union will control you, which is something that's actually in one of their slides. And they were implying it was going to be like a Crucible or Salem witch trial of like everybody putting each other on trial.
They really stopped just a sentence short of basically saying, hey, if you join this union, there's a chance that you could go to jail. I mean, we know that these are lies. And we've got partners who are 17 and 18 years old. If you're telling me that wasn't meant to scare people into thinking that, you know, this is something they could potentially be tried in a court of law for, I don't know what else the purpose of that would have served.
That kind of intimidation is terrible, and it's not just happening in meetings. Companies intimidate their workers and beat them over the head with propaganda during every waking moment and by any means available in the run-up to a union election. As a worker trying to form a union at Boeing described it back in 2017, a normal day consists of, you go to work, you'll hear something anti-union at your morning meeting, there will be some literature handed out, so when you take your breaks in the break area, they've got the TVs running and they play anti-union commercials throughout the day, and you top that off when you get home. You've got the anti-union commercials, radio and TV, and then you check your mailbox and you've got anti-union literature in your mailbox. And just so you know what to expect if this ever happens to you, anti-union messaging almost always relies on the same arguments. A good chunk of them are baseless appeals to emotion. For example, your boss might say that a union will ruin the family vibe at work. Or lie and tell you that the union will ask you to engage in acts of violence, or that come strike time, a union won't support you like they promised they will. It's all unfounded, but it's repeated over and over and over, and it's not really designed to have you hating the union so much as it is trying to plant a seed of doubt in your mind that can make sticking with the status quo feel like the safer option, and going with the union seem like a risk.
When I found out that Google was doing career certificates and they had one in data analytics, I thought it seems like an easy choice. After completing the program, I was familiar with all the tools of the trade, and I'm happy.
The Real, authenticated luxury resale. Over 10,000 new arrivals every day.
Gucci, Prada, Hermes.
But if that doesn't work, anti-union rhetoric will either be straight-up intimidation, like the way Starbucks implies legal repercussions,